Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Spar&Brawl. Saad Hariri, the Lebanese prime minister who mysteriously disappeared for a few weeks during a trip to Saudi Arabia 3 years ago, has once again been named prime minister of Lebanon. He won a slim majority of votes in parliament just after a year resigning due to mass protest. So, Sam, what do you make of this? Hariri not only resigned a year ago due to economic protests, but since then, Lebanon has, of course, been hit with COVID 19 like everywhere else. On top of that, there were the horrific Beirut explosions. The economic situation has not improved whatsoever. Poverty is increasing, both for the Lebanese population, but as well as for the Syrian population. So, what is your first take? What do you make of Hariri being renamed Prime Minister of Lebanon only a year after resigning due to mass protests?
Yeah, that was quite interesting because the mass protests that seemed to follow the explosion in Beirut, I mean, if I don't know if you recall the reporting, but people were angry at the whole political class, not just one group or the other. Hezbollah, the Sunni-backed group, the Christian-backed group, all of them, all
But
the people who,
Hariri had resigned earlier than that, right? Due to economic related
yeah,
protests. Yeah.
yeah, he had resigned a year ago because there was a protest a year before as well. But I mean, if there is a establishment figure within Lebanon, it is Hariri because I mean, he's a son of a former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri who was assassinated about I think 20 years ago, about 20, less than 20 years ago. He was assassinated, and he comes from a very rich and very prominent Sunni family that has extensive relations with Saudi royal family. They have, I believe, they have one of the biggest businesses in Saudi Arabia, construction company or something like that. Is a belongs to Hariri family. Uh, uh, Extensive relations, both Rafik Hariri and Saad Hariri, although they have proven themselves to be quite political operatives in that they have also extensive relationship with Iran, and they have managed to work with Hezbollah, and they have managed to work with America. So they work with everybody, it seems. Um, and but he's a very much an establishment figure. So the calls for change uh, does not seem to have worked because it's Lebanon is so factional that you end up with a compromise candidate, somebody who sort of everybody can sort of trust, but nobody can actually trust. You know,
So
so it seems
remind
factional.
everybody about the political system just quickly
Oh,
at the national level.
Lebanon is what they traditionally, I think, they call a power sharing system, in that it has a president, it has a prime minister, and it has a parliament, so to speak. That each of these institutions can be occupied by a person of a certain ethnic minority. The prime minister, I believe, uh, I don't, I'm not quite sure if this is enshrined in the constitution or if this is just precedent and, you know, like tradition, but I think it's enshrined. Um, I think the prime minister should be a Sunni individual or from Sunni political groups, a speaker of the parliament Shia, and the president a Christian, from a Christian minor. Well, I believe the Christians are the majority, so from the Christian ethnic group.
So pretty
So it's a
much
very much similar to Iraq is a similar type of system that I think a speaker again must be a Shia, but the prime minister is a Sunni. The president is a Kurdish individual.
so most likely a Shia Muslim or a Christian can't really become prime minister. So it only like cancels out a lot of options.
Sure, yeah, but I mean, yeah, but there were still quite a lot of other options, including there was a guy who they almost agreed on 2 weeks ago, but then it fell apart largely because the Shia backed Amal group, if I'm not mispronouncing that. I apologize if I do. They didn't back him, so that coalition fell apart, and they seem to have reverted back to Saad Hariri, who, in a way, to be honest, although I know people want to change, and he is clear. I mean, him and his family, they're clearly corrupt. This is a very, it's a very old established figure that has been in politics for many years with many stories, blah blah blah. At the same time, maybe somebody with experience, maybe it's somebody who can navigate through all these factional groups is not a bad idea in a way. An interesting thing though is that just this is from 21st of October, which is uh, I mean, I'm not quite sure what is the date today exactly when we are doing this recording. It's
We're the
23rd.
23rd. Yeah.
So, so this is, I think this, I'm not quite sure if this was before uh, he was announced as the prime minister. This is his fourth time, by the way, as the prime minister of Lebanon. I think this was just before he was announced as the new prime minister. Al Akhbar, which is a sort of a tabloid newspaper in Lebanon. They reported that Hariri has been receiving funding from the UAE to restart his TV network. And although Hariri's office, they have strongly denied the allegation, and they have referred to Al Akhbar as a foreign funded newspaper channel. So, I'm not quite sure if these allegations are true, but this is definitely not a figure of change. Certainly he's not that. Although, again, as I said, maybe perhaps experience uh, may prove to be more useful in these times for Lebanon. But if it's okay, I'm just going to give you a exact breakdown of the groups that are supporting Hariri now from inside Lebanon.
Please, but
So,
just sorry, just before you do that though, I was shocked that I didn't go look actively for every news story, but there weren't any prominent news stories featuring some of the reactions. I mean, I'm surprised this didn't lead to at least some protests or something that were covered by maybe some news channels. Maybe they were, but I mean, they literally put back the same guy in place who resigned a year ago, not his brother, not his cousin, not someone from the same political party, but literally the same guy. So that was just, that was funny. I
that's
wonder if
correct.
there have been any protests.
To be honest, I haven't read anything. Yeah, it didn't get much coverage. To be honest, the announcement itself, I I saw it first in a Persian um, writing uh, website. But no, I haven't read about any protests. But maybe that's because just people are exhausted at this point,
Yeah.
and yeah. But this is according to Al Jazeera. Hariri's dramatic return was enabled by the votes of 65 MPs from across the country's political spectrum, including his own future movement, the Shia Amal movement. The Amal movement, I think the current president is from this movement, and they have some ties to Hezbollah and Iran, but they're not exactly on the same. They are affiliated, but they're not the exact same, basically. The Druze Progressive Socialist Party, which is I assume a Christian party, and the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party, which is all right. That sounds good. Anyway, ostensibly secular but closely allied to Hezbollah, a Shia party with its own military wing. So he got 65 votes, um, and uh, uh, he became the prime minister. Interestingly, the Iran-backed Hezbollah party also did not vote for Hariri, though they have been among the most enthusiastic supporters of his return since his resignation on October 29 last year. So they
Yeah,
didn't
that
vote
last
against him, but they didn't vote for him.
yeah, that
Uh,
last
all
sentence is very interesting.
Yeah, I guess they recognize that he's a compromise candidate, but at the same time, they don't want to overtly support him because their political base will see it as a betrayal somewhat, I would
Of
assume.
course.
But yeah, yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Pretty much going back to where it was before. I tried to see if there was like takes from Turkey or Iran. I haven't found anything interesting yet. Uh, Perhaps maybe interesting reactions come. Perhaps if there are protests, we'll see.
Yeah.
But I think again, he's a compromise candidate, so it's fine. I don't think anybody will object to his premiership from. I mean, among foreign leaders.
Yeah, and among the political parties, clearly, in Lebanon.
Oh well, I mean, Lebanon is very. There are many small political
Yeah, but
parties. I'm
among
sure
the
a lot.
major ones, I mean, it seems like everything went smoothly there.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, and
yeah.
then, all right, so another piece of information that I read was that France apparently played a big part. So France has been more and more involved with Lebanon, I guess you can say, since the Beirut explosions. So what's France's role here?
That's yeah. Again, I saw that as well. I saw that. I couldn't, to be honest, really find any information on France's role on like getting what's his name, getting Hariri back into premiership. What is what is happening? It seems that France is basically playing the lead role in raising funds for Lebanon following the explosion for for rebuilding and all that. And they have already apparently raised about $200 million internationally. But they are connecting the payments, the basically giving the money to the Lebanese government to reforms. I mean, I guess as clearly we both have a slight, at least a slight left-leaning view, so we are naturally suspicious of. It kind of sounds like IMF reforms, that basically allows foreign companies to come in and swallow up industries. But I haven't really read the details on the reforms. They may be eh, just focused on corruption, which would be a good thing. But the whole thing, I don't know. For me, it has a bit of an imperialist smell to it, which I don't like. Anyways, they've raised $200 million. And they're planning and trying to raise more, but they said they're only giving the money if Lebanon commits itself to reforms. And I would assume France probably sees Saad Hariri as somebody who can pass the if there is going to be a bill that has to pass through the parliament for signing like a treaty that includes these reforms, he would be the guy who would be able to pass it through the parliament and uh, get it done basically. So I would assume France is happy with his election, but I mean I haven't found anything concrete about that. By the way, the thing is,
I wouldn't see why France wouldn't be happy. I mean, he's obviously. I think even though he had that little issue with the Saudis, just a year after that, in 2018, he came out and said everything is fine with the Saudis. So from that side, an ally of France, everything is okay. I don't see why France would really have an issue with him.
traditionally the Western powers like France they have a problem with him and his father to an extent whenever they got close to Iran or
Hmm.
Syria. And right now he's backed by Iran affiliated or connected groups, so they may have problems there. But yeah, I think they're largely fine with him there.
But
He's a
this. Sorry.
No, he's just a they trust him. They trust that he does the right thing, So
So just to put that 200 million that France has raised, more or less, into context. So this is raised for a country that has a terrible economy right now, and of course there were the Beirut explosions. So France has raised 200 million, let's say internationally. You know how much was raised for the Notre Dame fire
Oh
for
no,
a rich country such as France? So
no.
by 2019, so this was in 2019, so last year, by 24th of April 2019, ordinary people and billionaires had pledged at least 750 million euros to rebuild Notre
Jesus.
Dame after the fire. And
I
then
mean,
200 million here for Lebanon. And you kind of touched on them saying that, Harry, you just brought up Syria, and Syrian refugees there is another huge part of Lebanon society that we hadn't mentioned so far. But I mean, there are 4 million Lebanese living in Lebanon, and there are about 1.5 million Syrian refugees. And I know that over the years, their situation has also been deteriorating. Of course, if Lebanon's economy gets worse, so does theirs. But in Lebanon, they have an interesting dynamic with refugees, which is that they're not necessarily being hosted in camps. So Syrian refugees are pretty much allowed to live wherever they want, more or less, in Lebanon. Of course, they get help from humanitarian agencies and they can get tents and support to find shelter, but they don't have to stay in a specific camp, which is the case in most countries. However, one thing that's making their situation even worse in Lebanon and forcing them to work more underground if they can't find such jobs is that a lot of them, their permits have expired and they're unable to get new permits. So they're really afraid of, let's say, if they get caught while traveling from one place to another within Lebanon or anyway, and they don't have their permit, worst case scenario, they could get sent to Syria, or if not, there could be some.
Sorry, I didn't understand if they're allowed to live everywhere and they have the so why would they get their permit revoked?
They didn't get their permit revoked. It's just that now apparently it's become harder for one reason or another that once they expire for them to renew their permit. So for
Oh,
Lebanese
that's
authorities to renew their permit. So I'm sure a lot of Syrian refugees, I mean, we're talking about 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. So some perhaps have managed to get their permits renewed, so nothing can really happen to them. They can't get caught by the police and been thrown to jail, or let's say even sent back to Syria. However, many of
good.
them are apparently,
Yeah,
yeah,
it just wasn't clear to me. That's why, yeah,
yeah.
I see.
So I
Yeah, and
mean,
not to mention,
Lebanon's, yeah,
I think Lebanon, I mean, they host a significant number of Palestinian refugees
oh
as well,
yeah,
I think. I mean, I'm not sure how many are now. They may be second, third generation
yeah.
refugees now, so somewhat integrated into. So it's a, yeah, country with. I mean, Lebanon is one of those post-colonial states that I think sort of was created. We talked about this when we talked about the Lebanese explosion, but I do think it's somewhat structured to fail, in my view, at least at the moment. Maybe there is a way to create a unit. I don't know. I find it very difficult to imagine. But yeah, so it's a, yeah, with this many refugees, this many factions, the future is not looking great, I think, at the moment at least.
Yeah. So last week we did a story in Lebanon that was slightly more promising, and we'll just end on this, even though it was about normally we wouldn't be cheering for off drilling for gas in the Mediterranean. But last week we covered a story that Israeli officials and Lebanese officials came together for the first time in 4 decades to discuss non-war matters, and it related to their maritime boundaries, because of course off off offshore drilling for gas has become more and more prominent in the Mediterranean, and both countries are trying to get their hands on some reserves or find further reserves. But yeah, so anything else to add on Hariri's becoming prime minister again? I'm going to keep an eye on this and see if there are any protests or anything internally or how this plays out.
Not really, but yeah, I think we should keep an eye out. Maybe there will be interesting development, although it could develop into a very boring story of a, old guard coming to power and managing everything quietly. So we'll see.
Yeah, for a fourth term. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. If you liked, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, and if you loved it, make sure to subscribe to our channel.